Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Acknowledging that there's a lot of darkness in the world right now, I just wanted to start off with two positive things that I experienced over the past week. The first one was during our beitvirtuali adult education last week, and we're doing a class dealing with how can we be in dialogue with the very human-like attributes of the eternal that are presented in the Torah, even though Judaism works really, really hard to try to tell us that God has no human attributes. And we were reflecting on a verse from Genesis where God appears in the Garden of Eden, walks around, or at least is heard walking around, and Adam and Eve hide themselves. We spent 45 minutes on that one verse. 45 minutes. One verse that we can roll our eyes at, think is absurd, and we just kept on going deeper and deeper and deeper. And there was a part of me that just wanted to shout, we still live in a world where we can spend 45 minutes on a single verse in Torah. And I think every one of us, as we explored that, were elevated through that. Now, I'm going to see if I can relate that to our Parashat this week. The second really cool thing that happened was a dear friend of mine went the extra mile on social media. And usually when we think of how people interact with social media, the going the extra mile is the going the extra mile to vanquish someone. But this was kind of special. She had put up a reflective meditation and completed the meditation with for anyone who needs that right now. And what happened is as people started liking or loving or putting a care emoji there, every single person who responded, this dear friend then responded back to them by saying exactly how that person had affected and lifted up her life. Now, that's a few extra steps than we usually go through, and it was amazing to be on the receiving end of that. I think we're so used to someone jumping onto our page and attempting to vanquish us, that when someone actually says from deep in their heart with no hope of reward, I mean, this was not done through any selfish reasons whatsoever. This was done simply because she took it to heart that we need to be lifted up, that we need to be doing that. And in the process of doing so, there were dozens of people who received one of the most beautiful messages that I think we'd heard from outside our households in quite some time. It's an amazing thing to experience, but it took some effort and it took some work. For those of us on the receiving end, I can say pretty firmly that that work paid off, and I at least felt incredibly elevated, surprised, and lifted up, and it was beautiful. So right, what does that have to do with Vayikra, with Parshat Vayikra and the Book of Leviticus that we've started in? Yeah, this also is a bit of an eye-roll book for a lot of people, right? This is an entire book where it seems like the major themes are slaughtering animals and sprinkling blood on the horns of the altars. And this is one of those books that's difficult to read. Now, ironically, in Cheder, in a traditional Jewish education, you would actually start at age 4 reading the Book of Leviticus, which seems absolutely insane until you realize that we've got this value within Judaism that if we can't do something, we're still going to learn about it. And since we don't have a temple, then the knowledge of what happened in the temple is equal to performing that. And I don't know about you, but I don't really want to be performing any sacrifices. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think that whenever we reach any passage or a larger part of the Torah that is entirely foreign to us, we react by narrowing ourselves instead of broadening ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Just jumping back to the Garden of Eden story, I have seen so many people inside and outside Judaism, inside religion, outside religion, look at the story of the Garden of Eden, roll their eyes and say, see, this is why the Torah is so silly, because look at the talking snake, completely ignoring that the people who wrote about the talking snake, probably they themselves were not writing about a talking snake. They probably are just as intelligent as we are, and were writing about symbol and writing about metaphor and using their creativity in the same way that if we were to write about a talking snake, we'd probably be using our creativity as well. So we come to Leviticus, and instead of reading this as a potential well of symbols and metaphors, we look at the sacrificial system to which we have no relationship whatsoever, unless we're in the slaughtering business, unless we're a mishgiach, unless that is a part of our everyday life. We cannot calibrate to what life is like where that is central to our lives, and therefore we reject it. So instead of looking symbolically at this book, we look at it in a hyper-literal manner, and then we reject it for its literal meaning. Now remember, we can look at everything in the Torah. As a matter of fact, I'd say we're obligated to look at everything in the Torah, every Jewish text, through the complex modalities of literal interpretation, or at least surface meaning of the text, through the allegory, through the metaphors, through the symbols, and through that ineffable mystical underpinning which binds it all together. But yet the more problematic the text, for some reason, those are the texts that we only look at literally and say, well, I don't like that, which is a very strange thing to say when it comes to Torah. So the first thing that I would offer is jumping back to what happened this weekend in our Beitvirtuali class, and that is to say, if you actually just take a deep breath, get past the literal, and you begin an exploration on what other ramifications do these words have? What pointers can they give me to something deeper? Let's just take the general idea of Vayikra to begin with, that you raise yourself up on an altar. You're climbing these stairs. The priest climbs these stairs to this gigantic altar. So we're elevating ourselves. We're climbing up to this altar, and then we are engaging in ritual sacrifice and sprinkling blood on the four corners and horns of the altar. And so let's just remove the surface meaning of the literal and say, what does blood symbolize? What does an altar symbolize? What does raising ourselves or climbing up symbolize? What do the various different animals symbolize? And we start right there. All of a sudden, we ask questions like, well, what does an altar mean for us? Which ritual things do we build in our lives that we then sacrifice something on it? How about our jobs, or how about our bodies being an altar? And we sacrifice our own bodies in the altar of making sure that we can earn enough money to have the newest car that will impress our neighbors. See, it doesn't take very long before we can look at something that seems absurd and then start asking the question, what is an altar to me, and what altars have I built? Torah is only meaningful if we can pull it into today, if we can relate it, and if we say, what is an altar to me, all of a sudden Leviticus takes on a completely different meaning. And that's that combining with my first story. Every verse of Torah in a group that's willing to set aside preconceived notions, talk with each other, be in dialogue with each other and that which is greater than us, we can spend 45 minutes on each individual verse and find ourselves in worlds that we never expected. Torah is truth and contains truth within it because it's something that reflects the truth of the lives that we live. Not because we're supposed to look at a talking snake and take it literally, but because the talking snake tells us something about ourselves, because the act of sacrificing tells us about what it means to be sacrificed, to offer sacrifice, to feel part of a sacrifice, to give of something and expect nothing in return, to give of something and to expect something in return. These are all universal questions, and if we're not aware of any of those things, then first of all, we've missed out on the point of Leviticus, and second of all, we're not using our sacred texts as a reflection of who we are as people. Jumping back to that first story of the dear friend who lifted me up and lifted so many others up this past week, the second truth, or the meta-truth, that I can offer today about Leviticus is that it contains within it this idea that it takes work, effort, care, nurturing in order to make sure that our relationships are healthy. Look at the types of sacrifices that we have. Over the course of the book of Leviticus and over the course of Jewish tradition, we learn about 3+1 major types of everyday or continuous sacrifices, the Tamid. So we've got our morning sacrifice, our afternoon sacrifice. It's not really a sacrifice in the evening. It's a process by which we clean things up. And then on special days, on holidays, we have an additional sacrifice, a musaf sacrifice. And let's just look at the relationship that's most important to you in the world. For many of you, if you are fortunate enough to have a partner, it's going to be your partnership relationship. Maybe it's your relationship with your kids or your parents or your dearest friend, but whatever it is, what's the single most important relationship to you? And now use Leviticus, the tamid, the continual offerings, as a symbol. When you wake up in the morning, do you have a ritual by which you connect with your partner? What about sometime in the middle of the day? Regardless of if you're together, if you're in different places, is there something that you can check in with each other? Because days can start going south pretty quickly. What about when you're back together at the end of the day? Is there a process by which you clean up everything that's happened over the course of the day and prepare yourself to re-enter into that night, the relationship with each other, laying to bed, literally and metaphorically, all that which has happened the previous day and preparing for the next day? And then what about on those special days where something is worth celebrating? What do we do additionally on that day? And think about the times when our relationships are not going well. I will bet you anything that we've gone in those times several days in a row, several weeks, God forbid, several months or years in a row, and we've just lived our everyday without thinking about having something that binds us in the morning, something that binds us. We check in over the course of the day. Something that allows us every single day to clean up the junk that might have happened. And then that celebration, the obligation to celebrate when something special is going on. That's what the daily offerings are. And then when something really goes bad, we've got the sin offerings. We've got the gratitude or votive offerings. And what are those things? Well, what if I really, really mess up? The daily offerings aren't going to do it. I have to do something completely different to recognize I've done something wrong and to work harder to repair that at that moment. That's the Book of Leviticus. This is the stuff that we look at and we roll our eyes because we are not calibrated to a sacrificial system. Thank goodness. But I would like to think that the people who wrote the Torah, who edited the Torah, who brought us Judaism today, also did not think this is the only way you can look at it. These texts are so complicated. They seem to be constantly reflecting back and saying, pay attention. It's not about what you think it's about. So there we have it. A couple beautiful things that happened to me. I would love to hear in the comments down below after Shabbos if something positive happened to you that had to deal with someone nurturing a relationship, that had to do with going deeper into something you'd never expected before. With that, Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next time.